Today's video is sponsored by nobody. I'm what some might call a brand risk. Hi there. As you can see, I've updated my sprites, so now I'm wearing a mask. Don't worry, it's totally COVID related and has absolutely nothing to do with my insecurities about my face. Why would you even ask that? But seriously, over the past few years or so, I've been getting very self-conscious about my face, and since wearing masks became socially acceptable, I've managed to have an out for it. Now that's out of the way, let's talk horror stories, specifically the tabletop variety. If you go to Reddit, type r/rpghorrorstories in the search bar, you get a whole mess of chaos to scroll through, and we're gonna look at one of these today. Through scrolling, I found this three-parter. So I thought this will be fun to discuss in the next 3 videos. No chance am I gonna put all this in one fucking video, no way in hell. Nobody here on YouTube in their right mind does that anyway. Crow's Perch, he's never made a Saga video. Den of the Drake, when has he ever done one? Anyway, today's story not only involves one problem player, but 5. As far as I've skimmed, I haven't really read it yet. So let's sit back, make yourselves uncomfortable while we read... Why are Reddit titles longer than that vegan teacher's video titles? I started to tell this story a couple of times in a couple of communities online, but I found my notes and man did I get it wrong. I was too nice. So here's the whole story. I've been both a DM and a player for many years, and while I only took part in a couple of longer running campaigns, I was lucky. The worst players of any of them were smaller issues, such as a DM that allowed drinking during the game. Oh yeah, that never happens in a dignified D&D game. Why would you even? Had to be called early because someone got too drunk to dice, or a party that couldn't function as a party. You know you're in for a good time when this happens. Grog would be proud. It happens, skills improve, games improve, life goes on. This time, however, was my introduction to 5e, as I had played up through 3.5e and given 4e a miss. It was also my first time playing the game online. The red flags started early. I was asked to just quote-unquote update a 3.5e character because the DM didn't like session zeros once a campaign was underway, and I was the last to arrive at the table. In other words, use the 3.5e books and tools and let the DM just interpret on the fly for 5e. Yikes. We were told we all needed backstories that required we each earn 10,000 platinum. Here's our cast of characters / people. Names changed, obviously. Me, a warlock tiefling whose pact involved murdering an innocent once per month as payment for his patron to keep his powers and return his village, which was now on another plane, back to this world. Crick. A fighter that something restore honor, something 10k plat. You really didn't like this guy, did ya? He was a murder hobo and didn't last past 1 session. I just mention him now for accuracy. Malady, the DM, who had crafted this world for quote-unquote years and would later introduce a DM PC that fits the name. Oh no. No, why? So many of these horror stories involve the dreaded DM PC. Treff. For this campaign, a rogue with the libido of a common bard. Oh no. Relatively new player. Quiet. Another rogue. Very quiet person. Girlfriend of Edgy. Edgy. An Aarakocra rogue, and yet another rogue. That was sort of a stereotype in RP, but for a good reason. Are we not gonna get to what that reason is? Okay. We were introduced to a world where we all came to work in this flying city that was receiving refugees from some big bad thing that happened to the world. We were all seeking our fortunes with the Adventurers Guild, which was tasked with 1. Plumbing a nearby dungeon, which changed in nature every 3 days, and 2. Defending the city from major threats. Additionally, we could invest in the town, making more items available and generally making shopping easier and defense better. We were all rather excited with the possibilities, and the first couple of sessions were fun. But they revealed a major issue. You see, the DM didn't want to deal with some of the difficulties in migrating a 3.5e character to 5e, which does require DM involvement. For those who played them, if you play a 3.5e warlock with 1 level of fighter, your character can get OP, especially in roleplay, really fast. And that's what this was. This upset the balance really quickly, but my concerns I was taking too much of a lead in certain scenarios were just dismissed as, it's alright, I'll adjust for it. Not much into planning, are we? DM was not as capable as she presented herself, and I found myself just avoiding using certain abilities so as not to totally derail the game. It started stressing me more than it was fun, which kinda defeats the purpose of this make-believe pastime we love so much, don't it? Other players started having issues of their own. Edgy and Quiet would start missing sessions. Then Quiet quit. Boy, did I have fun reading that.
Flashback.
Then Quiet. Then Quiet. Then Quit. Then Quit. No. Then Quiet quit. There it is.
End of flashback.
Because the DM had trouble involving them. Crick lasted 2 sessions that were mostly roleplay before quitting because the response to him trying to murder Hobo was, instead of being told no, constantly being slapped around by townspeople. That sounds about right. DM said it would get better, as in our first trip to the dungeon, we'd meet someone who changed everything. The first instance of the dungeon was pretty basic and had some ancient ruins in it. In those ruins, we found a warforged with tons of equipment. Malady, salty. Malady had a host of abilities, including charging a cannon anime style while taking damage, and then releasing a blast that was always about 5 times the damage she took. This solved nothing and introduced a new problem.
Anytime I had a problem and I threw a Molotov cocktail, boom, right away. I had a different problem.
All combat was now on a win condition timer. We didn't really have to risk anything. Just hold our own until Mary Sue popped off and wiped the field with her ultra mega plot cannon. Plot cannon? Ultra mega plot cannon. I could redo that, but I'm busy. Her only weakness seemed to be memory, and the DM preset had a fix where she just had to rest for 3 days with her equipment after being recovered and she'd be fully repaired. Equipment? Fully repaired? Is she a robot? What's she made of? Is she a fire hazard? Would y'all date someone if they were a fire hazard? Where was I going with this? Nobody liked the DMPC, and water is wet. And after 2 sessions, Edgy walked. The party was now me, Treff, and Malady Sue. Nice. It was clear the DM was frustrated I knew my way around D&D as I used my charisma score to the full effect with beguiling influence, and invested all of my earnings in the town's investment mechanic. Suddenly, Malady had a high charisma and started doing the same things. The DM clearly trying to make sure my character didn't have any advantage she didn't have. I get a +1 item, she gets a +2. I invest in the local bookstore, she invests in the jeweler and suddenly gets access to items way above our level. Why all the envy? Y'all are supposed to be on the same team. Let me clarify, I'm talking about the DM, not OP. She started taking any suggestions or complaint as direct criticism of her as a person instead of as a DM, particularly once we reached a point that she was clearly fudging the DMPC sheet between sessions. I think the DM is trying to win at D&D. No idea where she got it in her head that D&D has a winner, but she's lost the concept that victory is collective. The closest thing I can think of that counts as winning is your character living to fight another day. Victory after a campaign belongs to everyone, not just one person. She's also trying to make her character the best in the game. In my opinion, the best character isn't the most powerful, it's the character that everyone can get along with and count on the most when they're needed, and doesn't always hog the spotlight. I tried to curb this as my character was a prankster by messing with her equipment at random, but that only made her talk with a Scottish accent for 2 minutes before she auto-corrected. I have no idea what that means, but holy shit, if she has dialogue in this saga, I'm so putting on my best Scottish accent for it. Then there was the ride armor. Tell me more. Basically Ivas from Evangelion. She insisted they were necessary for certain encounters where we were called to defend the city, but they all had their own stats and ignored our character classes. To her credit, she did amend this, but then multiplied the HP of all the enemies significantly and changed all of our attacks in the armor to use D100s to see how much of the damage got through. Do D100s exist? I'm sorry I asked. The combat itself was a new system on its own and was always against something that we wouldn't normally face until we were around like level 15 at the earliest. We're talking Final Fantasy damage numbers here, with DMPC always doing 9999 damage. And her DMPC was still a Doom Clock, so for me, it was about trying to resolve combat creatively before she fired off so that I could at least feel like I accomplished something. Treff just rolled basic disinterested attacks, and none of us enjoyed these bits that came every time the dungeon was resetting to a new format. The dungeons weren't coherent either. It was more like a portal to an entire world that was entirely unaware that it only existed for 3 days. There was one where we all had to drive futuristic tanks and had a totally new form of combat. Again, this time featuring different dice. Again. There was a trip to Hyrule, where Teff stole the panties of Princess Zelda and wore them, which somehow the DM ruled caused him to turn into a futanari with enormous attributes. And my character wound up with a fairy he rescued that turned out to be a vehicle for the DM to try to get me to do lewd roleplay with an NPC where I did the fade to black as my roleplay to get out of it. This campaign is on drugs. Too many drugs. And if it's not taking drugs, it needs to be on drugs. Prescription drugs. Get help. The DM was getting more lewd with the sessions. Malady was suddenly famous and loved by everyone, and Teff and myself both stopped looking forward to the sessions. It was tiring to learn new combat rules every week or two, having our character choices matter less and less, and a DM who was so focused on us clearly telling Malady's main character story that she wasn't even paying attention to what we were doing or what her rulings would cause to happen. She tried bribing us with more frequent level ups, so by the time the 3rd month came around, we'd gone from level 3 to level 17. Frustrated that this made it harder for her to marry Sue, she then started implementing punishing side effects on us for items or use of abilities. Treff's new attributes started getting in the way of his proficiencies, and my beguiling influence was constantly detected by even the lowliest commoner, so they wouldn't trust me. When we had to face a Dracolich in the ride armor, she tried to kill my character, and honestly it was a suicide can I leave now attempt. When I ejected from the armor and used my fly speed to make contact with the phylactery in its chest and used Devour Magic on it. And it worked. I survived the resulting "cause you broke my boss fight" damage with 2 HP. It became really toxic. The game turned into Treff and I trying to play D&D in spite of the weird new rules almost weekly, and DM trying to stop us and railroad us into her mechanics. That dissolved into some interesting risk-taking by myself and Treff just to see what would happen that caused the big bad evil guy to suddenly manifest only to have it banished by a wish 1 round later. Then there was the trip to the anime world that resembled Ghost in the Machine, but also .hack//sign, don't ask me because I stopped fucking caring, which went more like a normal D&D, except one thing. You see, the money from each dungeon world had a conversion rate that was automatically processed when leaving that dungeon. All of them used money local to their universe, which rendered our own wealth useless going in, but meant we got money for use in town whenever we left. In the Gits World session, I happened to convince someone to give me a large amount of the money in the local currency, and also kept looted money instead of spending it in that zone. DM thought nothing of it, instead focused on describing the epic blastings of plot cannon on the enemies we encountered. When I left, I hit the quote-unquote impossible goal of earning 10k platinum. Remember that from the setup of the campaign? Well, when I got back, my character had no motivation to continue. He had a hot fairy wife that could change size at will and adored him, was level 19, and had earned in just a couple of months the entire amount to pay off his patron. Oh, I interpreted his intro wrong then. Turns out he needed to sacrifice people and pay money to his patron. I mean, I could go back and retake that bit, but not today. I summoned him the moment we got back and paid him. Had a curse from the Dracolich incident, which really just gave him some features that were flat out cool and resistance to necrotic damage, and my arc was just done. My character wanted to take his wife with him and get a hero's welcome back home. The DM refused because she was pissed. "You weren't supposed to earn that much that fast," she said. She threw up blockades at the airship port so I couldn't leave, forgetting a 3.5e lock can usually fly for an entire day at a time. She tried to give me nearly impossible checks involving charisma that I still managed to pass, literally trying to basically imprison my character in her scenario. Treff, seeing this, lost all interest in playing because he realized he too was close to his goal and didn't want to deal with this. DM finally threw up her hands and the campaign dissolved. We were told we gave the world over to the big bad evil guy and he destroyed everything, though it took so long we got to live out our lives. Maybe it was a gimme to keep us from getting mad again, but whatever. I knew I'd been the asshole here sometimes because when I wasn't heard, the "let's see what happens" approach was largely blatantly trolling the DMPC or setting her up to fail and discovering she couldn't. That's my favorite kind of troll, when you can see someone's doing something wrong and you just pretend to be supportive and you're like, no, keep going, trust me. I did feel a little guilt for this and recommended maybe we try a full 5e campaign with no extra rules that were heavily homebrewed. Treff enthusiastically agreed and asked if he could try his hand as a DM. Edgy declined to come back as they'd recently broken up with Quiet and wasn't sure Treff's campaign would be any better anyway, and wanted to see how it went first. Edgy did tell me if I started a campaign myself he'd like an invite, or if Treff's campaign really took off. I don't know, that last bit seems kind of a red flag to me personally, cause it kinda shows he's only interested in playing if it has value, rather than just trying to have fun with friends. But that's neither here nor there, because Edgy's not the one on the scaffold here. I've spent some time with the 5e books and started putting together a character for Treff's campaign, which he said would be set in modern times, kind of like Dimension 20, but not really. I love modern campaigns and I was stoked. Honestly, same. I love urban fantasy. Feel free to see how that went in Part 2. Fair warning, unexpectedly NSFW content will be in Part 2. Oh shit, Susan, brace yourself and your pearls for Part 2. And since it's on this subreddit, you can already tell it's not the better tabletop paradise OP was hoping for. And that's where we close today's longer video. You guys hyped for Part 2? Hope so. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today and for watching, and I'll catch you guys at the next video for Part 2.